Before I talk about the new book directly, I want to place it in the larger body of work it comes from, because this book did not appear out of nowhere. Some of my work has taken the form of historical fiction. I have been drawn again and again to the places where history, religion, power, memory, myth, and the human soul collide. Historical fiction allows me to enter those worlds dramatically. It lets me explore early Christianity, suppressed spiritual movements, empire, heresy, forgotten voices, persecution, sacred violence, and the long human struggle to understand God without surrendering the mind. Those stories are fictionalized, but they are not empty entertainment. They are built around the same questions that keep returning in my nonfiction. What happens when power takes control of religion? What happens when truth is buried under authority? What happens when the human soul is told to obey instead of awaken? And what happens when inherited systems no longer heal the people they claim to save? My historical fiction gives those questions bodies, voices, scenes, conflicts, betrayals, and consequences. It lets the reader feel the pressure of history instead of merely reading an argument about it. But beneath those fictional worlds, there has always been a deeper philosophical concern. I have been circling one central problem for a long time. The modern world has lost the soul in two different ways. On one side, inherited religion too often buried the soul beneath fear, contradiction, guilt, obedience, and institutional authority. On the other side, modern materialism reduced the soul to mechanism, chemistry, brain activity, appetite, social function, and biological accident. One side said, "Do not question." The other side said, "There is nothing sacred here to question." Both answers are incomplete. Both fail the human being. That is why my critique of materialism matters so much. I am not criticizing science. Science is one of humanity's greatest acts of self-correction. Science becomes trustworthy precisely because it allows reality to correct false models. The problem is not science. The problem is the worldview that takes scientific description and turns it into a metaphysical prison. That worldview says that only matter is real, only measurement is serious, only mechanism is intellectually respectable, and consciousness is basically an accidental glow produced by the brain. In that world, love becomes chemistry, beauty becomes neural reward, conscience becomes social adaptation, religion becomes projection, and the soul becomes a poetic word for processes not yet explained. But human beings do not actually live as machines. We suffer inwardly. We love inwardly. We feel guilt, beauty, awe, grief, longing, remorse, reverence, and the hunger for meaning from the inside. No matter how much the machine world explains, it does not fully interpret the conscious being who is doing the explaining. That is the crack in the materialist wall. Consciousness is not just one object inside the world. Consciousness is the condition through which any world appears at all. Every denial of the soul appears inside consciousness. Every theory of matter appears inside consciousness. Every act of doubt, every scientific observation, every argument against God, every experience of love, pain, beauty, and moral failure appears inside consciousness. That is the deeper background behind this new book. My books and available works can be found on Amazon under the author name Lucian Seraphis, and this new book belongs beside them as one of the clearest statements of the larger project. The title is God, Consciousness, and Quantum Reality, a constructive theology of self-correction, magic, and the evolution of consciousness. This is the book where the argument becomes direct. The historical fiction explores the wounds through story. The critique of materialism names the philosophical problem, but this book attempts to build the theological answer. It asks what religion can become after contradiction. It asks what God can mean after the collapse of the old punitive images. It asks what consciousness means in a universe that cannot honestly be reduced to dead matter. It asks whether magic can be rescued from fantasy and understood as disciplined symbolic agency under real constraints. And it asks whether healing is possible when the self stops defending false models and begins reconciling with reality. So when I announce this book, I am not simply announcing another title. I am announcing the next stage of a body of work. The historical fiction, the critique of materialism, the theological reconstruction, the work on consciousness, the symbolic language, the concern with magic, ritual, self-correction, and restored wholeness all meet here. This book is where those streams become one argument. It is my attempt to say that the soul does not have to choose between bad religion and dead materialism. It does not have to choose between fear and emptiness. It does not have to choose between superstition and reduction. There is another path, a religion of recognition, reconciliation, self-correction, disciplined symbolic practice, moral repair, and restored wholeness. And that brings me to the book itself. God, Consciousness, and Quantum Reality begins with a daring claim, but not a careless one. It argues that God may be understood as creative consciousness, the primordial and ongoing movement by which reality emerges from incompletion toward order, intelligibility, self-correction, and restored wholeness. That is the heart of the book. That is the sentence. Everything else circles, tests, deepens, and returns to. Today I want to announce something new, something that has taken a long time to think through, write through, wrestle with, refine, and bring into a form that I believe finally says what I have been trying to say. The new book is called God, Consciousness, and Quantum Reality, a constructive theology of self-correction, magic, and the evolution of consciousness. That is a large title, because it is a large subject. This is not a small book about one idea. It is not a devotional book in the ordinary sense. It is not a science book pretending to prove God. It is not an occult book promising that desire can override reality. It is not a religious book asking anyone to shut off the mind and believe contradictions because someone in authority said so. It is something else. It is an attempt to rebuild religion from the ground up in a way that can survive contact with science, philosophy, consciousness studies, moral seriousness, trauma, magic, ritual, beauty, and the actual condition of the modern human soul. The central claim of the book is simple enough to say, but it takes the whole book to unfold properly. God may be understood as creative consciousness, the primordial and ongoing movement by which reality emerges from incompletion toward order, intelligibility, self-correction, and restored wholeness. That is the heart of the book. That is the sentence everything else circles, tests, deepens, and returns to. But I want to be very clear about what the book does not say. It does not say that quantum physics proves God. It does not say consciousness studies have already proven the soul. It does not say magic means you can command the universe like a servant. It does not say suffering is secretly good. It does not say religion should return to fear, obedience, humiliation, or punishment. In fact, the book argues almost the opposite. It argues that religion has to be rebuilt precisely because too much inherited religion has confused mystery with contradiction, reverence with submission, morality with shame, and God with a magnified human ego. A God who needs flattery is not God. A God who becomes insecure when questioned is not the highest truth. A God who uses fear as the main instrument of spiritual formation is not love. A God who requires the human mind to betray honesty in order to preserve belief is not worthy of worship. That is where the book begins. It begins with refusal, but not a refusal of the sacred. It refuses bad religion in order to rescue what religion was supposed to do. Because human beings still need religion. That is one of the major arguments of the book. We need meaning. We need ritual. We need moral repair. We need symbols large enough to hold grief. We need ways to return after failure. We need practices that help us face reality instead of hiding from it. We need beauty, awe, discipline, reconciliation, forgiveness, consequence, and transformation. When religion fails, those needs do not disappear. They migrate into politics, ideology, consumer identity, therapy culture, conspiracy culture, entertainment, addiction, private despair, and the endless hunger for something that feels like belonging. But needing religion does not mean we should accept contradiction. A false medicine does not become true because the patient is desperate. A broken theology does not become sacred because it is old. A cruel doctrine does not become holy because it has been repeated for centuries. So the book asks a different question. What would religion look like if it were rebuilt around truth instead of fear? What would God mean if God were not imagined as a supernatural tyrant above the universe, but as the creative consciousness through which reality moves toward order and wholeness? What would salvation mean if it were not escape from consequence, but restoration through recognition, reconciliation, and self-correction? That phrase, self-correction, is one of the spines of the book. Science is trustworthy because it allows reality to correct false models. A theory that refuses correction becomes ideology. A religion that refuses correction becomes dogma. A self that refuses correction becomes trapped in illusion. A culture that refuses correction becomes brittle, defensive, and eventually violent. So the book treats self-correction not as humiliation, but as the condition of truth. To be corrected by reality is not to be destroyed, it is to become less false. That matters because most of us do not suffer only because the world is hard. We suffer because we carry false models of ourselves, false models of God, false models of love, freedom, pleasure, pain, guilt, forgiveness, power, desire, and identity. When a person lives inside a false model long enough, the soul begins arguing with reality. It defends what is hurting it. It calls bondage freedom. It calls fear holiness. It calls vice personality. It calls resentment justice. It calls avoidance mercy. It calls numbness peace. And then the person wonders why life feels divided from within. Religion, at its best, should help us recognize that division. It should help us stop lying to ourselves. It should help us reconcile with reality. But when religion itself becomes the lie, when religion teaches fear, contradiction, submission, and shame, it no longer heals the wound. It becomes part of the wound. That is why this book is called a constructive theology. It does not simply attack old religion. It builds another model. The first part of the book begins with the problem of the dead world. Modern materialism has given us an image of reality as mechanism, and that image has enormous power. It has produced science, medicine, technology, engineering, and the ability to measure the world with astonishing precision. The book is not anti-science. I want to say that clearly. It respects science deeply, but it rejects the idea that scientific description is the only kind of truth. It rejects the reduction of consciousness to a meaningless accident. It rejects the flattening of love into chemistry, conscience into adaptive behavior, beauty into neural reward, and the soul into obsolete language. The machine world can measure many things, but it cannot fully interpret the one who does the measuring. It can describe brain states, but it does not fully answer why there is subjective experience at all. It can track behavior, but it does not exhaust meaning. It can simulate language, but simulation is not the same as inward presence. A machine can produce words about grief without grieving. It can produce words about beauty without beholding beauty. It can imitate concern without being inwardly moved. And the more powerful imitation becomes, the more important it is to remember the difference between surface response and conscious presence. That is one of the reasons consciousness is so central to the book. Consciousness is not just another object in the world. It is the condition under which any world appears. Every theory of matter appears within consciousness. Every denial of the soul appears within consciousness. Every scientific model, every doubt, every argument, every act of perception, every experience of beauty, guilt, love, pain, and wonder appears within consciousness. That does not automatically prove a religious doctrine, but it does mean consciousness cannot be brushed aside as a trivial byproduct. It is the place where reality becomes inward. The book engages consciousness studies carefully. It talks about the hard problem of consciousness, the difference between explaining cognitive function and explaining subjective experience. It looks at theories such as global neuronal workspace theory, integrated information theory, predictive processing, embodied approaches, illusionism, panpsychism, analytic idealism, and conscious realism. It does not pretend these theories all agree. They do not. It does not claim that one of them has settled everything. None has. What matters is that the question is not closed. Flat materialism has not won by default. The mystery of consciousness remains intellectually serious. Then the book moves into quantum theory, information, and the softening of matter. And again, the boundaries matter. This is not quantum mysticism. The book does not claim that the observer in quantum mechanics means human intention magically manufactures ordinary reality. It does not say wave function collapse is the same as prayer. It does not turn physics into spiritual marketing. What it says is more modest and more defensible. Modern physics has made crude, common-sense materialism harder to defend as a complete metaphysics. Matter is not the simple dead stuff people once imagined. At fundamental levels, reality involves probability, relation, measurement, information, and interpretive difficulty. That does not prove God, but it does weaken the arrogance of the dead machine worldview. The book also enters more controversial territory with Field's intuition and relational mind. It discusses Rupert Sheldrake's field theories and the idea that consciousness may be more relational than flat mechanism allows. It treats those ideas cautiously. It does not present them as settled science. But it does ask whether reports of intuition, relational knowing, and the strange ways living beings seem to respond to one another might be prompts for a broader metaphysical imagination. The question is not whether every extraordinary claim should be believed. The question is whether reality is more deeply relational than reductionism allows. From there, the book turns toward the human being as a refraction of source consciousness. This is where the symbolic language becomes important. The flame, the fragment, the prism, the refraction of source consciousness. These are not decorative images. They are ways of speaking about the human soul as finite, wounded, partial, but still connected to a deeper creative reality. The human being is not God in a simplistic sense. The ego is not divine just because it wants things. Private desire is not sacred simply because it feels intense. But human consciousness may be understood as a finite participation in creative consciousness, a refraction of the deeper source. That means the wound is not the final truth of the person. The fracture is real, but it is not ultimate. Trauma is real, failure is real, guilt is real, limitation is real, the past is real, the body is real, consequence is real, but restoration is also real. Not restoration as going backward into some untouched innocence. That is impossible for many people. The self does not always become whole by returning to what it was before the wound. Sometimes the self becomes whole by reorganizing around the truth of what happened. It becomes coherent under constraint. That is why neuroplasticity matters in the book. The brain can reorganize. The self can adapt. Patterns can change. Attention can be retrained. Behavior can be redirected. Ritual can stabilize intention. Symbol can organize emotion. Practice can alter the internal model through which a person lives. None of that means healing is easy. None of that means every wound disappears. But it means the human being is not merely a broken machine. The person is a living, adaptive, conscious system capable of reorganization. This leads into the book's reconstruction of magic. Magic in this book does not mean supernatural control over physical law. It does not mean fantasy. It does not mean pretending constraint does not exist. It means disciplined symbolic agency within a constrained field of possibility. Human beings do not create reality from nothing. They do not abolish causality. They do not get to override the world by wanting hard enough. But they do create internal models. They sustain attention. They encode intention through symbol. They reinforce desired states emotionally. They notice pathways that were previously invisible. They act differently. They generate feedback loops between consciousness and environment. Over time, those loops can change the trajectory of a life. That is magic purified of nonsense. It is not omnipotence. It is participation. It is the ritualized and symbolic form of conscious participation in possibility under constraint. This matters because modern people often split into two failures. One side says only mechanism is real, so ritual, symbol, prayer, and magic are childish illusions. The other side says desire creates reality, so constraint is just a limiting belief. Both are wrong. The human being lives between constraint and possibility. The world resists us, but it is not closed. The body limits us, but it can adapt. The past shapes us, but it does not have to define every future movement. Symbol does not violate reality. It helps organize the self's participation in reality. The book then develops religion as self-correction. This is where theology becomes practice. Religion is not primarily about appeasing God. It is not about flattering a divine ego. It is not about performing obedience so that power will reward you. Religion becomes coherent when it becomes the disciplined return of the self toward truth. Recognition is the first religious act. Reconciliation is the second. Restoration is the third. Self-correction governs the whole process. Recognition means seeing what is real, not what flatters us, not what protects our favorite identity, not what excuses our vice, not what preserves our resentment, what is real. Reconciliation means the self stops arguing with that reality. It stops defending the false model. It stops turning pain into permission. It stops calling avoidance healing. Restoration means the divided self begins to reorganize around truth. That is also why the book reframes sin as missing the mark. The phrase matters because it preserves moral seriousness without trapping the person in permanent shame. To miss the mark is not nothing. It means the person has fallen out of alignment with truth, conscience, love, responsibility, and the good. Harm matters, consequence matters, repair matters. But the person is not reduced forever to the failure. The mark remains, reality remains, the path of return remains. This is especially important in a culture that tends to swing between two extremes, permissiveness and punishment. Permissiveness wants love without consequence. Punishment wants consequence without restoration. A self-correcting religion refuses both. It says harm must be answered. It also says the soul must have a path of return. Civil consequence and spiritual restoration are not the same thing, but both matter. Law can restrain behavior. It cannot by itself restore the soul. Religion can address the inward disorder, but it must not use inward healing as an excuse to erase outward responsibility. The final movement of the book is restored wholeness. This is where the theology becomes embodied. A religion that only explains the soul will fail to hold the soul. Human beings need ritual, beauty, awe, community, memory, recommitment, and embodied practice. We need fire, voice, silence, gesture, symbol, music, art, mourning, confession, and return. Not because God needs performance from us, but because we need practices that reshape us. We need ways to stand before reality and remember what we are trying to become. Ritual matters because the mind does not change by information alone. Anyone who has ever known the truth and still failed to live it understands this. Information is not transformation. Explanation is not embodiment. A person may know what is good and still be ruled by compulsion. A person may understand the wound and still repeat the pattern. A person may confess the truth and still lack the structure to live differently. Ritual gives form to repetition. It gives the body a way to participate in the truth the mind has recognized. It turns insight into practice. Beauty matters because beauty interrupts reduction. The machine world can describe beauty in terms of perception and reward, but the experience of beauty exceeds that description. Beauty arrests us. It takes us out of appetite and calculation. It reminds us that reality is not merely useful. Awe matters for the same reason. Awe places the ego back in proportion. It does not destroy the self. It resizes the self. It lets the person feel that life is larger than private fear, private craving, and private grievance. Freedom from vice also becomes central. The book does not define freedom as doing whatever impulse demands. That is not freedom. That is servitude with flattering language. If anger rules you, you are not free. If lust rules you, you are not free. If envy rules you, you are not free. If resentment rules you, you are not free. If fear rules you, you are not free. If addiction rules you, you are not free. Freedom means becoming less beholden to the forces that fragment the self. It means the person can act from coherence rather than compulsion. So the book's vision of restored wholeness is not soft. It is compassionate, but it is not sentimental. It does not say everything is fine. It says reality must be recognized. It does not say every wound disappears. It says the wound can be reorganized into a deeper order. It does not say desire is evil. It says desire must be disciplined. It does not say guilt should destroy the person. It says guilt should become recognition, repair, and return. It does not say God punishes imperfection from above. It says God is encountered as the creative consciousness by which the fragmented becomes capable of wholeness. This is why the book matters to me, because I do not believe the modern soul is simply unbelieving. I believe the modern soul is exhausted by bad options. It is too intelligent to accept contradiction without strain. It is too spiritually hungry to accept dead materialism without grief. It is too wounded to survive punishment masquerading as holiness. It is too undisciplined to become whole through indulgence alone. It needs something better than bad religion and dead matter. It needs a path that honors science without reducing consciousness, honors religion without protecting contradiction, honors magic without denying constraint, honors healing without erasing consequence. and honors mystery without using mystery as an excuse for incoherence. That is the path this book tries to build. God, consciousness, and quantum reality is not asking the reader to believe impossible things. It is asking the reader to stop defending false things. It is asking whether God can be thought again, not as an insecure monarch above reality, but as creative consciousness moving through reality toward order, intelligibility, self-correction, and restored wholeness. It is asking whether the human soul participates in that movement whenever it becomes truthful enough to recognize error, disciplined enough to correct itself, courageous enough to reconcile with reality, and creative enough to transform suffering into renewed form. That is the religion of restored wholeness. That is the book I am announcing today. If you have ever felt trapped between religion and reason, this book is for you. If you have ever rejected inherited religion but still felt the hunger for meaning, this book is for you. If you have ever felt that materialism explains the body but not the soul, this book is for you. If you have ever been wounded by fear-based theology, this book is for you. If you have ever been drawn to magic but wanted a disciplined, reality-based understanding of it, this book is for you. If you have ever believed that healing is not denial, that truth is not cruelty, that consequence is not damnation, and that restoration is more than comfort, this book is for you. The book is God, Consciousness, and Quantum Reality, a constructive theology of self-correction, magic, and the evolution of consciousness. It is a theology for an unfinished universe. It is a rejection of the dead machine and the punitive idol. It is an argument that consciousness matters. It is a reconstruction of magic as disciplined symbolic agency. It is a model of religion as self-correction. It is a path of recognition, reconciliation, repair, and return. And at its center is one idea: reality is not finished, and neither are we.